Okay, you want to own a data center. Here's the pitch you've probably heard, maybe from a YouTube ad, maybe from a guy at a conference with a very expensive watch. Buy some land, put up a building, fill it with servers, lease the compute to AI companies and cloud providers who are desperate for capacity. Sit back and collect rent on electricity and silicon. It sounds like the 21st century version of owning an apartment building, except instead of tenants, you have GPUs, and instead of a landlord, you're basically running a private utility. That pitch isn't a total lie. The global data center market is worth over $300 billion and growing at a pace almost no other physical infrastructure sector can match. Real money is being made. Some of the fastest fortunes of this decade are being built inside buildings that look like enormous windowless refrigerators. But here's what that pitch conveniently leaves out. The capital expenditure is brutal. We're talking hundreds of millions of dollars before a single customer signs a contract. The hardware inside that building, the actual GPUs doing the AI work, is depreciating in real time, sometimes losing a third of its value in a single year. The electrical grid, the actual physical infrastructure of the power system, is now the binding constraint on the entire industry, not money, not demand, electrons. And once you're up and running, the operating margins on the wrong side of a bad power contract or an unleased building can go from healthy to negative astonishingly fast. This is not passive income. This is one of the most operationally intense, capital-hungry, technically unforgiving businesses you can enter. So let's actually open the books. Before you generate a single dollar of revenue, you have to survive phase 1, construction. And in 2026, this phase alone is enough to end most people's ambitions. The industry doesn't price data centers by square footage anymore. It prices them by megawatts of capacity, because power delivery, not floor space, is the actual product. As of 2026, a standard, shell and core tier III facility, the reliability standard most commercial colocation operators build to, costs roughly $7 million to $12 million per megawatt, with the global average sitting around $11.3 million per megawatt. Want to build something tier IV, fully fault-tolerant, and optimized for dense AI workloads with liquid cooling? Now you're looking at $15 to $20 million or more per megawatt. And some fully built AI facilities, including the tenant technology fit-out, push past $37 million per megawatt all in. Let's ground that in a real number. A modest 10 megawatt standard facility costs somewhere around $100 to $120 million to build. If it's AI optimized, you're now closer to $200 million, and that's before a single server goes in the rack. Where does that money go? Electrical infrastructure, switchgear, backup generators, and interruptible power supplies eats 40 to 45% of the total build cost. Cooling systems take another 15 to 25%. The building itself, the part most people picture when they hear data center, is actually the smaller piece of the pie. Now for the part that actually determines whether you're building a cash machine or a money pit, the compute hardware. A single 8 GPU HGX H100 server, the current generation workhorse of AI training, runs $250,000 to $320,000 in 2026, or roughly $36,000 per GPU deployed. Step up to NVIDIA's newer Blackwell architecture, and an 8 GPU HGX B200 server costs $400,000 to $500,000, if you can even get an allocation. A full GB200 NVL72 rack, the dense, liquid-cooled configuration hyperscalers are racing to deploy, runs approximately $3 million per rack. Multiply that across a facility with thousands of GPUs, and the hardware cost can dwarf the building cost. This is the part most outsiders never see. The building is often the cheap part. The silicon inside it is where the real capital goes. Here's the trap that catches even sophisticated operators off guard. AI hardware depreciates like a smartphone, not like a building. An H100 GPU that sold new for $40,000 in late 2023, by 2026, used units of that exact same card are trading for $12,000 to $22,000 on the secondary market. That's a loss of roughly half to two-thirds of its value in under 3 years, and that's actually one of the better performing chips, because H100s at least have a functioning resale market. The pattern generally holds. Cards hold roughly 75 to 85% of their value through the first 24 months. Then depreciation accelerates hard as newer architecture ships, Hopper, then Blackwell, then Rubin, each generation making the previous one economically obsolete for training the largest models. even though the hardware still physically works fine. Why does this matter so much financially? Because your loan officer, your investors, and your own balance sheet don't care whether the chip still runs. They care what it's worth. If you finance $200 million of GPUs with debt, and those GPUs are worth half that in 3 years, you have a serious problem. You're paying off a loan against collateral that's evaporating faster than the loan amortizes. This is fundamentally different from owning real estate, where the building tends to hold or even appreciate in value. In this business, a meaningful chunk of your capex is on a countdown timer. And then there's the cost category nobody puts on the glossy investor deck. Getting permission to exist. Utility interconnection, literally paying the power company to run enough capacity to your site, can cost $5 to $25 million or more, depending on how far you are from existing grid infrastructure. In power-constrained markets, some developers are now building their own power generation on site, natural gas plants, solar arrays, even small modular nuclear reactors, adding another $3 to $10 million per megawatt. On top of that, environmental permits, water rights for cooling, zoning approval, and increasingly, multi-year interconnection studies, just to confirm the grid can deliver what you're asking for. In many primary markets, developers are now locking in power capacity 18 to 24 months before they even break ground. Because the queue for grid interconnection has become the actual bottleneck of the entire industry, not money, not land, not demand. You've survived construction. The facility is live. Now you enter the phase that never ends, keeping this thing running, every hour, every day, forever. Power is the single largest ongoing cost, typically consuming around 40% of a data center's entire operating budget. Industrial electricity rates vary by region. In Texas, large users typically pay 7 cents to 10 cents per kilowatt hour, and nationally the range for large-scale industrial power sits roughly between 6 cents and 12 cents per kilowatt hour depending on state, grid congestion, and time of day. Here's the metric every operator lives and dies by: PUE, or power usage effectiveness, total facility power divided by the power that actually reaches the computing equipment. A PUE of 1.0 would mean zero energy wasted on cooling, lighting, or overhead. That's the theoretical, unreachable perfect score. In reality, the global average PUE is about 1.56, while the most efficient hyperscale facilities get it down to around 1.09. That gap isn't a rounding error, it's the difference between paying for 56% overhead energy versus 9%. On a facility drawing tens of megawatts around the clock, that inefficiency translates into millions of dollars a year, permanently. For the life of the building, cooling alone consumes 30 to 55% of a facility's total energy, averaging around 40%. Traditional air cooling, the big evac-style units most legacy data centers use, is cheaper to install but far less efficient at high densities. Modern AI racks running dense GPU clusters can draw 20 to 100 plus kilowatts per rack. Traditional air cooling simply cannot remove heat that fast. That's why liquid cooling, pumping fluid directly to the chip, or fully submerging hardware in dielectric fluid, has become mandatory for AI-dense facilities. It costs more to install, generally $1,000 to $2,000 per kilowatt in additional capital, but it's dramatically more efficient and is quickly becoming table stakes for anyone hosting serious AI workloads. And then there's water. Some facilities use up to 5 million gallons of water a day for cooling, comparable to over 16,000 households. That's a utility bill and a public relations risk, especially in drought-sensitive regions like Arizona or Texas. A data center with no connectivity is just an expensive warehouse. Getting data in and out requires dedicated fiber connections, often dark fiber, meaning private, leased fiber optic lines that aren't shared with the public internet, plus peering and cross-connect arrangements to link directly with cloud providers, carriers, and internet exchange points. Cross-connects alone typically run $50 to $300 per connection per month, and large facilities can have hundreds of them. Most serious operators pay for at least two physically diverse fiber paths, because a single fiber cut taking down your only connection is not an acceptable risk in this business. Staffing is smaller than power, but it's not trivial. Large facilities typically budget $5 to $10 million a year for engineers, 24/7 network operations staff, and physical security. Infrastructure maintenance, generators, UPS batteries, fire suppression, cooling systems, runs another $10 to $25 million a year for a large-scale operation. Then there's insurance, and this is where the risk of the business really comes into focus. Operators carry cyber liability coverage, physical hardware damage coverage, and critically, coverage tied to SL penalty exposure, the contractual payments owed to customers when uptime commitments are breached. Those penalties are not small. Industry reporting puts SL violation penalties as high as 20% of a client's annual contract value. One documented case: a provider with $10 million in enterprise contracts paid $1.5 million in SL credits after a single 4-hour outage breached a 99.9% uptime guarantee. Insurance premiums themselves can jump 20 to 50% after a major incident, a cost that follows the business for years. So how does this building actually make money? The first model is colocation. You rent out power, space, cooling, and connectivity, and the customer brings their own servers. Pricing is quoted in dollars per kilowatt per month. As of late 2025 and early 2026, the North American average for mid-size wholesale deployments hit roughly $196 per kilowatt month, up sharply from $120 per kilowatt month just 4 years earlier. Smaller retail deployments pay significantly more, sometimes $370 per kilowatt month at typical Tier 1 rates. The second, faster-growing model is wholesale AI compute. You own the GPUs too, and you rent out raw processing power by the GPU hour. Cloud H100 rental rates in 2026 run roughly $2 to $8 per GPU hour, with spot pricing sometimes dipping near $1.43. That's a fundamentally different, and much larger, revenue stream than simply renting rack space. Let's actually run the numbers on a 10 megawatt facility. At standard colocation rates, a megawatt of capacity generates roughly $4.4 million a year. Fully leased, our 10 megawatt facility brings in about $44 million a year in gross colocation revenue. Now convert that same 10 megawatts into dense AI compute instead. Practitioner estimates put AI cluster revenue potential at $10 million to $60 million per megawatt per year, meaning that same electrical connection, repurposed for AI workloads, could generate anywhere from $100 million to $600 million a year. Same power draw, wildly different revenue ceiling. This is exactly why every operator on Earth is racing to convert standard capacity into AI-ready capacity right now. But gross revenue isn't profit. You have to subtract electricity, cooling, staffing, maintenance, insurance, and critically, the amortized cost of your capex, including that fast depreciating hardware we talked about earlier. Here's the range that matters. A well-run, fully leased, efficiently operated facility can post healthy net operating margins in the 25 to 30% range. Genuinely a strong business. But that same facility, if it's running an inefficient PUE, sitting on unleased capacity, or absorbing a bad power contract, can see that margin collapse to under 5%, or go negative, even while gross revenue looks perfectly healthy on paper. That swing, from comfortably profitable to underwater, often comes down to one number: occupancy. Which brings us to the biggest risk in the entire industry right now. Here's the boom side of the story. AI demand has triggered the largest infrastructure build-out in a generation. North American colocation vacancy sits at a record low 1%, and a staggering 92% of capacity currently under construction is already pre-leased before it's even finished. U.S. data center construction starts hit $77.7 billion in 2025 alone, up 188.8% year over year. That is not a typo. Construction spending in this sector nearly tripled in a single year. Now here's the risk that keeps industry analysts up at night. This entire wave of capacity is being built on a bet that AI compute demand keeps growing at its current pace for years to come. But two things could break that bet. First, training efficiency. Every few months, researchers find ways to train comparable AI models with meaningfully less compute. If efficiency gains outpace demand growth, the amount of raw compute, and therefore raw megawatts, the industry actually needs, could grow much more slowly than the capacity currently being built for it. Second, grid throttling. Power utilities in high-demand regions are already warning they can't keep up. If grids start rationing new interconnections, which is already happening in parts of Virginia and Ireland, supply gets constrained from the utility side, not the developer side, stranding projects that are otherwise ready to go. The nightmare scenario for an owner: you spend 2 to 3 years and hundreds of millions of dollars building AI-optimized capacity, and by the time it's finished, either the demand has cooled, or the power you were promised never fully materializes. You're left holding a building engineered for a boom that moved somewhere else. Let's walk through how this actually goes wrong in practice, a composite scenario built from the failure patterns the industry has already seen repeatedly. A mid-size independent developer sets out to build a 20 megawatt AI-optimized facility. Total project cost, roughly $350 million, financed with a mix of equity and, critically, a large construction loan, collateralized partly against the GPU hardware itself. The plan depends on two things going right: securing a long-term power agreement at a favorable rate, and pre-leasing enough capacity to major AI clients before the loan payments come due. Here's where it unravels. The utility interconnection, initially quoted at 18 months, slips to 30, a common occurrence as grid queues have backed up across the industry. Construction financing costs keep accruing every month with no offsetting revenue, because the facility can't legally draw the power it needs to open. By the time the facility finally comes online, one of the two anchor tenants the developer was counting on has already signed a longer-term deal with the hyperscaler instead, because hyperscalers can guarantee power delivery timelines that independent developers often can't. Now the facility opens half-leased instead of fully leased. Revenue comes in at roughly half of the pro forma model. Meanwhile, the GPU hardware inside, financed against its purchase price, has already lost a meaningful chunk of its collateral value in the 18 months it sat waiting for the facility to open, because newer chip architecture shipped in the meantime. The debt service is fixed. The hardware collateral is shrinking. The revenue is a fraction of what the model assumed. This is precisely the mechanism: power delays, hardware depreciation, and under-leased capacity, arriving together, that has pushed multiple independent data center developers into distressed refinancing or forced sale in recent building cycles. It's rarely one catastrophic event. It's three manageable problems arriving at the same time, on top of a business that had almost no margin for error to begin with. Beyond the headline risks, there's a set of quieter problems that erode margin every single month, whether anyone's paying attention or not. Stranded capacity, the data center equivalent of a trucking company's empty return trip. Every rack, every kilowatt of power you've built out, but haven't leased, is a fixed cost you're paying for with zero revenue attached. In a business where the entire model depends on high utilization to justify enormous fixed capex, idle racks are pure margin destruction. PUE inefficiency and thermal throttling. We covered the PUE gap earlier, but here's the operational version. If your cooling system can't keep pace with the dense AI cluster, the GPUs themselves throttle down to avoid overheating. That means you're paying full price for compute capacity that isn't actually delivering full performance. A double hit: wasted power and under-delivered service. Penalties. We touched on this, but it's worth repeating with the real numbers. Average downtime across large enterprises now costs roughly $15,000 per minute, according to 2026 industry reporting. If you're promising 99.99% uptime, the standard enterprise expectation, you have less than an hour of total allowed downtime for the entire year. A single serious incident can consume your whole annual maintenance budget in one afternoon, before you even count the contractual penalties owed to affected customers. This is the uncomfortable truth at the center of the whole industry. The biggest players have structural advantages that independent operators simply cannot replicate. The largest cloud providers can sign direct power purchase agreements, long-term contracts, sometimes decades long, locking in electricity at favorable rates directly from generators, occasionally even funding new power plants or nuclear restarts themselves to guarantee supply. An independent operator, by contrast, is often at the mercy of whatever rate the regional utility offers, with far less negotiating leverage. Hyperscalers also design custom silicon, proprietary training and inference chips, which sidesteps the NVIDIA GPU market entirely, avoiding both the premium pricing and the brutal depreciation curve we discussed earlier, because they control the chip design life cycle themselves. And they operate at a scale where a single percentage point of PUE improvement, spread across their global footprint, saves hundreds of millions of dollars a year, funding a level of R&D into cooling and efficiency that a mid-size independent operator simply cannot match. The result: independent, mid-size operators increasingly get squeezed into a narrower and narrower lane, serving enterprise clients who specifically don't want to be on a hyperscale cloud, competing on power costs they can't fully control, using hardware they have to buy at retail while hyperscalers design their own. It's a real business. It's just a much harder one than the pitch deck usually admits. Let's put it all together with two scenarios for our hypothetical 10 megawatt AI-ready facility, built for roughly $200 million. Optimistic case: the facility is fully leased to enterprise AI clients on 10-year power purchase-backed contracts before construction even finishes. Revenue lands around $100 million a year, on the conservative end of that AI compute revenue range we discussed. After electricity, cooling, staffing, maintenance, insurance, and amortized hardware depreciation, the facility posts a healthy net margin, around 25 to 30%, somewhere around $25 to $30 million a year in net profit. Debt service on the construction loan is comfortably covered. This is the dream scenario. And it does happen, especially for operators who secured power contracts early and locked in long-term tenants. Pessimistic case. Power prices spiked 20% due to regional grid congestion. The facility opens with 30% of its capacity unleased because a promised anchor tenant delayed their deployment. Meanwhile, newer GPU architecture ships, and the hardware installed just 18 months ago has already lost a third of its resale value. Revenue comes in closer to $60 million a year instead of $100 million, but fixed costs, debt service, and depreciation don't scale down with revenue. Net margin compresses to under 5%, or in a bad enough year, turns negative, meaning the facility is losing money even while
technically running successfully and serving real customers, same physical facility, same equipment. The entire difference between these two outcomes comes down to occupancy, power contract timing, and how well the operator managed the two biggest risks in this business. There's one more risk that catches operators off guard even when the underlying business is sound: the cash flow timeline itself. Enterprise sales cycles for large colocation or AI compute contracts routinely take 6 months to over a year to close, and payment terms on multi-million-dollar annual contracts can stretch net 60 or net 90. Meanwhile, debt service on a multi-hundred-million-dollar construction loan doesn't wait for your sales team to close deals. It's due every single month, from the day construction financing converts, regardless of occupancy. That mismatch, long enterprise sales cycles against fixed, immediate debt obligations, has forced more than one otherwise viable data center project into a liquidity crisis, even when the long-term unit economics were genuinely sound. In this business, being right about the market isn't enough. You have to survive the gap between spending the money and collecting it. So what actually separates the developers who make it from the ones who don't? Power-first location strategy, choosing sites based on grid capacity and interconnection timelines before anything else, not based on land price or proximity to a city. Long-term power purchase agreements locked in early so a grid price spike doesn't blow up the entire margin structure. And an obsessive, almost religious focus on PUE, because in a business where electricity is 40% of your operating cost, every fraction of a percentage point of efficiency compounds into real money year after year for the entire life of the asset. So, is owning a data center a good business? For the operators who can secure cheap, reliable power, build efficiently, and lock in long-term tenants before the concrete even cures, this can be one of the most durable, high-margin businesses in modern infrastructure. But it is not passive income. It is not a real estate play with better tenants. It's closer in spirit to owning a private power plant that happens to also run computers, with all the capital intensity, engineering complexity, and unforgiving physics that phrase implies. The building doesn't generate the fortune. Surviving the gap between breaking ground and turning a profit does. If you found this breakdown useful, let me know in the comments what infrastructure business you want broken down next. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.